This is the second half of a two-part series, so if you haven't already, make sure you watch part 1 about my role as a UX designer, which I'm going to link up here and put in my descriptions. So let's go over the following: the setting, the product, the types of people I work with, the types of assets, and the daily responsibilities as a product designer. And if you stick around, I'm gonna go over the pros and cons of my role as a product designer so you can figure out which one will be better suited for you between UX design and product design. If you need to skip around, make sure you take advantage of the timestamps. Let's first go over the setting. Now, regardless of whether or not the role is a UX design role or product design role, you could be in an environment like a startup, you could be at an agency, in-house, at a corporation, or even freelance. But for the role that I'm currently in today as a product designer, I work in-house at a corporation, which touches on the next subject, the product. So because I work on one brand, typically at any given time, I focus on one product. Now that's different from when I was working at an agency where yes, I mainly worked on websites, but they were different because they were for multiple clients in different industries with completely different goals. Now this is where I think the biggest difference between product design and UX design comes in, and that's that this role as a product designer is a lot more technical. I'm much more involved with the product team, and compared to my previous job as a UX designer, I'm fully responsible for the UI for the product that I'm working on. And you'll be able to see this with this next topic, which is the people that I work with. The people that I work with now as a product designer and the amount of exposure I have to them are much different than the people that I work with when I was a UX designer at an agency. So I work really closely with product managers and product owners who are responsible for the product's development and strategy, branding and marketing to ensure that the brand strategy is communicated effectively throughout the product experience. The tech team, which are developers or even the tech leads to ensure that the designs are executed correctly, other UX designers, and other stakeholders, which are like leadership, operations, etc. Anyone who has a stake or involvement in the product decisions and designs that you make. So yeah, if you take this list of people and compare it to the types of departments and people I work with as a UX designer at an agency, it's pretty different, and there's no longer clients, there's no account managers, and there's no graphic designers or visual designers or art directors involved. Let's move on to the types of assets that I'm working on as a product designer. The list doesn't really change, and I'll put the same list here that I did for my UX design role at an agency with the addition of two big differences here. The prototypes become much more complex. And the second one is that I have to work within a given design system now, where when I worked at an agency, the brand guidelines and all the UI was based off of whatever the company had already established or what the graphic designer had in mind while working with the art director and the branding strategist. But now I'm responsible for the UI, and I have to ensure that whatever component or design that I choose fits within the guidelines that we already have established for this product. Moving on to daily responsibilities. Honestly, it mainly stays the same to my responsibilities as a UX designer, but the content is just a bit different. For instance, a big chunk of my day-to-day still involves meetings, but instead of with like clients and internal people and it being a mix, it's mainly with, or it's really all just with internal stakeholders and internal members that I work with. And again, the biggest difference here is that relationship with the product team. I'm involved in a lot more conversations with the product team, talking about what kind of features we need to prioritize and what's best for the users and the business, what's considered MVP and what's going to be the next versions after that in the roadmap, what will the roadmap look like so designs can get ahead of development. All right, now that you have a good understanding of my current role as a product designer, let's go over the pros and cons. Let's start with the pros first. In my experience, I find product design a lot more challenging. Because it's so technical, it's really complex. I don't have a background in software engineering, and I don't understand like half the things that the developers are talking about, but because of that, I find it incredibly rewarding when I'm able to integrate design with tech. This second pro I know I touched on a little bit, but that's longevity. You get to see your products grow. When I worked at an agency as a UX designer, I basically had my designs, and it was essentially like my baby that I made, and then the baby went away to like college or something. I never found out if like that college kid actually got a job and like did they do well in life. I didn't really get to see it grow from there. But now as a product designer working on one product, I'm really able to take my time to understand what's going well with it and what's maybe not going so well, and finding gaps in order to constantly improve the user's experience and the product's goals. But I will say there's like a flip side to that, and maybe sometimes it might get boring. So that brings me to the cons. Slower days where we're just maintaining the product and we're not necessarily looking for like giant changes right now just because of like business decisions or seasonality things. And that's different from what I mentioned as a UX designer at an agency where everything's like really fast paced and things are happening all the time. Now, the second con of product design, and honestly this varies on the industry, but compared to being a UX designer at an agency, it's just like sometimes not that sexy. Let me tell you though, websites, in my opinion, are just like a lot more visually appealing. I myself didn't work on creating all the graphics for the websites that I mocked up, but being able to kind of sit with the team and collaborate on like new trends that we can put on websites and like animations and crazy graphics, like that stuff is really fun. But with product design, like I mentioned, you're working within a set of guidelines and a system that you are kind of, you know, forced into a box with, compared to something like an agency where typically clients go to you to do something fresh and new and awesome and cool. That's not to say that that's true for every case, because I did work at a startup at a product designer as well, and that's when we were doing some like crazy stuff. So it really depends. Now that you understand my role as a product designer, if you haven't already, make sure to watch part 1 of this series about my role as a UX designer. I'm gonna link it up here, and it's also gonna be in my descriptions.